Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. We're going to get this kicked off and started. It's about 2 after 7:30, so I want to respect everyone's time, as I know it's a very busy time of year for everyone. Um, Thank you for joining us. My name is Nicholas Colglazier, the Executive Director for Colorado Corn, and we're putting these webinars on as everybody knows 2020 has been a bit of a challenge, and it's turned a lot of things topsy-turvy. But we wanted to give you a perspective of what's going on and all the work that's happening on your behalf to promote the growing demand for corn, so that you know that we're still working on your behalf, working hard to find ways to increase demand and to add value to the price that you'll see at the elevator. And so with us today, we have two gentlemen with us with the United States Meat Export Federation, and their mission is to increase protein exports from America across the globe. These deal in beef, pork, and lamb, but today we're going to focus on beef due to beef's prevalence in Colorado. And so without further ado, I'll introduce our two speakers. First is John Hinters Jr., and he joined the United States Meat Export Federation in 2001. As the Vice President of Industry Relations, Hinters is responsible for the financial aspects of the USMEF's export marketing programs, new business development, membership, and industry relations. And in addition, Hinters leads many USMEF member delegations and grassroots trade groups to international markets where they can witness firsthand the efforts of their financial investments in building U.S. red meat exports and red meat demand. Also with us today is Dave Juday. Dave Juday is a senior analyst of World Perspectives, Inc., Washington, D.C. market and policy analytics firm. Juday is the firm's primary livestock analyst and has long experience working with commodity groups. Previously, Juday was an aide in Congress and worked in the executive branch. He's also a graduate of Purdue University. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this morning and giving us your insights about what's happening globally with exports of protein from the United States, and just kind of recap what's happened during these crazy COVID times and kind of the future of what we're going to be looking out on, and maybe some bright spots. So John, we'll take it away, and I'll go ahead and share my screen with your presentation.
Thanks, Nicholas. Basically, I'd like to welcome everybody and appreciate your interest in U.S. red meat exports. So we'll pull up the PowerPoint here, but the U.S. Meat Export Federation was established in 1976 as a nonprofit trade association. We're not in Washington, D.C. lobbying. We've got other national organizations that do that on behalf of the meat industry. However, what we are is a promotion arm for the red meat industry internationally. So we are located in downtown Denver, Colorado, about 2 blocks from the state capitol. We have an office of 30 individuals that work in Denver, and if you look around the world, we have another 70 staff people that only focus on exports of U.S. beef, U.S. pork, and U.S. lamb. So we're the red meat side of things. So if we can go to the next slide. As I mentioned, if you look at the Meat Export Federation, we are in 18 international locations around the world. And when you think about our offices, you've got to look at some of the largest markets. Japan, for example, Mexico, for example, they would have the vast amount of employees, up to 12 people in those particular markets. And when you get into some other markets, like the Philippines, Vietnam, so on and so forth, we may have 2 or 3 people. When those subset markets are very important to the United States. However, they're not taking the majority of the red meat exports. We have, as I mentioned, a grassroots organization. We have 285 members, and they're mostly member organizations. So an individual, typically joins through his organization. So Colorado Corn is one of those 285 members that participates in the U.S. Meat Export Federation's mission. And our main mission is to put U.S. meat on the world's table. We know that's valuable. We know that we compete for shelf space around the globe. And certainly there are markets that are very important to that corn-fed, highly marbled red meat that we have to offer. If you look around the world, there's a lot of grass-fed beef. There's pork around the world. There's lamb, but we've got a really distinct niche when you look at that high-quality marbling, and that's basically derived from great genetics that we have here in the United States, and it's also derived from our feed stuff. We're feeding corn. We're feeding that corn. We've got these cattle right now, about 12% grade and prime. When I first started with the Meat Export Federation, I was thinking about this the other day, and I think we were about 3.5% prime. So how do you get prime cattle? The world desires that. We're going to have better genetics. We've got great corn and feed that go into these animals, and we're likely feeding them a little longer than we have been just due to some of the COVID situations. We are exporting. We have our products in over 80 countries around the world. But for the most part, if you look at where 80% of our exports go, you can put that in about 7 countries. And this year's been a little bit interesting. We'll go to the next slide. From a standpoint, this gives you a snapshot of where we're located. Mexico City, Colombia, Lima, Peru, Singapore, Taipei, Hong Kong, Eastern Europe. We just added an individual in Durban, South Africa. This market is a market that we're focusing on. It's got one of the youngest demographics around the world. And as these young people become wealthier, they're going to want to eat higher on the food chain. So we are seeing increased exports into this market. Like Dan Hallstrom, our president and CEO, said, South Africa reminds him of what Mexico looked like 30 years ago. So we're going to see growth in this market. This 1.3 billion people are going to want to eat higher on the food chain. So real opportunity for meat, and hopefully it's going to be U.S. meat. So let's just move on to the next slide and kind of give you a snapshot of where we are this year. COVID, up until COVID hit, we were doing pretty good on exports. It's been a little bit of a lag. This will be January through July. The food service industry, just like the United States, has been devastated around the world. And so we've had to adapt our programs and move them into some retail. One of the things that we've done in Japan and markets like Korea and Mexico is we've offered to help some of these food service organizations that sell U.S. product with delivery, discount deliveries and so forth to the consumers. It's not like the United States. I mean, when you have a curfew in some of these countries, you are basically required to stay home until your day is given to where you can get out. So, and sometimes you can only get out for 2 hours a day. So it's like a lockdown sentence in many cases in some of these restricted countries. So what are you going to do? You're going to require your food to be delivered in many cases. So that's where we've made a little niche in helping support some of these food deliveries, whether it be from retail or food service. But as you can see, Canada, China, Taiwan, the Middle East, the ASEAN, Africa, South America, these are all key markets for the United States. We do think that we will continue to make headways into the Japan and Korea market as those markets rebound from the COVID situation. And we think there's a real opportunity in the fourth quarter to make up some lost ground. Mexico and South America, they're a little bit behind us. It could be a little more challenging. Next slide. Next slide, we'll talk about the variety meat exports. Some of the top markets, as you look at a value, this is right now we're at $4.2 billion. Just go back about 4 years ago at this same time, we were looking at $3.9 billion. So Japan's our #1 value market. They like high quality grain-fed product. Korea is acting much like Japan. Last year, I think we were looking at a $1.8 billion market in Korea. We've always said that's a market of 50 million people, and they like their meat, and they like U.S. meat. They like the marbling. They're only going to get that through that corn-fed product. So we are growing our market share in Korea. And I'll just kind of give you a snapshot. We can go back to year 2008, and there were 100,000 consumers in Korea, South Korea, marching against U.S. beef. They thought that we were sending in tainted BSE product. They were basically marching against their government, and their government approved U.S. beef at age 30 months of age and over. And we weren't selling anything. And we went into a major campaign. We utilized corn checkoff dollars. We leveraged those dollars with USDA funding. So basically, through the investment of your corn checkoff dollars and a 6-month campaign, we were gradually able to get back into that market, start to build trust. And today, through some of those steps 14 years ago, certainly now we're looking at a $1.8 billion market. And I always say that wouldn't have happened if we weren't in the market promoting, and it takes dollars to do that. So Nick, let's just roll through the next few slides, and we're going to turn it over to Dave Juday here in a minute. Value of exports per head slaughtered, as you can see, 2019, it was about a $310 value. Like I said, next slide, I'll kind of give you an idea where that value is coming from. Japan's about $87 of that 300. Korea's $74. Those are two key markets that we cannot afford to lose shelf space in. They certainly are supporting the beef complex. We know that this whole beef situation has been a little disjointed this year. Marketing hasn't made a lot of sense. We haven't been able to get the cattle processed like we wanted to. And certainly we've seen some disruptions in the market chain, whether they're domestic or international. And, it's just been an interesting, tough year due to the COVID situation. So we hope that that'll level off and we can get back to a normal marketing system where everybody enjoys some profitability throughout that chain. We'll go to the next slide here. Let's talk about some of the beef primals exported and what we send out of the country. For the first time in 20 years, I've been working here at the Meat Export Federation. I never thought we'd get criticized for exporting. And, it came. There's a lot of misinformation. As I mentioned, we export beef, pork, and lamb as an organization. We don't actually sell the product, we're promoting. So some of the companies that we're exporting, the news got a hold of it and said, hey, we're sending all this good product outside the United States. Well, when you really think about it, really, from the standpoint of what we export, we're not sending a lot of that loin, strip loin and tri-tip and some of these items out. Actually, we're sending about 4% of that product out. What we are sending though, is you look at that belly, that short plate, and those that belly part, that goes into Japan and Korea. It gets sliced and put over a bed of rice. It's thinly sliced. And, rather than keeping that in the domestic market and grinding it, we're able to sell that at a higher price. Look at that flank. You look at that flank right down there in the bottom, right in front of that round. We only send 2% out of that flank out. And Nick, you might say, well, why is that? We keep a lot of that product here in the United States for fajita meat. So we're not exporting it. The United States is paying a premium for that flank steak, that flank meat. So it stays right here. So, I kind of would give you that idea. We'll go to the next slide. And I think the telltale story of exports is not always the muscle cuts that we're sending out, but, we're sending nearly $1 billion of that $8 billion in variety meats. Just look at that tongue, lips. We send lips to Mexico. When you look at lips to Mexico, about 1.3 pounds. That gets sliced and diced for fajita meat. You take those hearts and kidneys. We were talking about that right before we got on the call here. South America, Colombia. We have a gentleman in South America, Don Mason. And, I've worked for the beef industry a long time and done a lot of steak fries, and we've done some hamburger cookouts, so on and so forth, helping some county cattlemen years ago in my younger years. But never once did I ever do a liver promotion. And, we are working to promote liver. We're working to fight anemia with young children. We have campaigns in these South American markets. And this liver-rich with iron helps fight anemia. And we've cooked it in ways that it is very palatable, and consumers are enjoying it, and they're feeding it to their children. So we lost a little bit of the liver market to Egypt due to some religious reasons. Basically, markets like Peru and South America and Colombia, they've taken up that market. Stomachs and intestines, Mexico and Asia are a big market for those stomachs. You know, these are all items that add value. And we'll go to the next slide here. So basically, a couple of things I just want to leave you with before we turn it over is when you're in these different countries, we're guests. So there's certain things that we need to do. If you look at, for example, South Korea, there's as many as 20 different countries vying for shelf space at the retail shelf. You know, what are we going to do to work with our importers, work with the retailers selling our product? Well, one of the things we've done is we've provided masks, we've provided hand sanitizers right in front of the meat counter, and it says compliments of the U.S. Meat Export Federation. In the Dominican Republic, you know, there was a lot of food service operators that ultimately found themselves without jobs. So one of the things that we were able to do is work with some of our importers, and we put together gift boxes for them, for some of their families, and provided that information, and provided some food for some of the food service workers that found themselves without jobs. And also, in addition, those first responders, those people in the hospitals, just like the United States, you know, long hours, working hard, trying to save lives due to this whole COVID situation. In Mexico City, we have worked with a dozen chefs. They helped put together sandwiches, well over 1,000 sandwiches with some personalized notes, and it said, enjoy some of the high quality U.S. meat. And the media got a hold of this, and the media did a number of stories on social media and so forth, and they counted that it was over $200,000 in free publicity to the U.S. beef industry just on what these chefs had did for a lot of the front first responders and the nurses and doctors at the hospitals in Mexico. So I think there's some goodwill activities that we should be proud of as an industry. We're in this for the long haul. We need to continue to differentiate ourselves on why U.S. product is good, why it's great, and why we're ahead of our competition. And one of the ways we're doing that is talking about the value of the corn feeding that we have, telling our story, telling the sustainability story that it all has as it relates to red meat exports. So just go to the next slide. Just wrapping up, this will be my last slide before I turn it over to Dave. As I mentioned, we entered the South Africa market. These are a couple wraps that are promoting U.S. beef on some of these semis. It's almost shameful how cheap this is to do this, you know, but it was so cheap that we ended up doing it on, we started with 5 more, and I think our intention is to do another 10. But that market is growing, and there's a good opportunity for U.S. product. It's not going to be a Japan. It's not going to be a South Korea. But in 30 years, we're going to say we're glad we entered that market, because we think that there's a tremendous amount of potential for over 1.3 billion people to start eating more and more of our U.S. product. One thing I will leave you with, every time that we send a round out of the United States, beef round, you know, we're sending 7.3 bushels of corn out with that round and 166 pounds of DDGs. We send out the brisket and that flank plate, 6.3 bushels of corn, 143 pounds of DDGs. Every ham we send to Mexico, you know, we're sending out, you know, additional 9.1 pounds of DDGs and 2.7 bushels of corn. I was mentioning to Nick, I had some time last week. We did a little farm tour, and went out and spent some time with some of our officers that are out and about. And one of the pork producers that we talked to said he had to change up his ration. He went back to feeding him more and more corn, and he wanted to slow his hogs down. And I think he said he increased the bushels of corn per pig another 3 bushels just by taking out some of the other ingredients and adding corn. And I think there's a lot of different things going on out there, but nonetheless, corn's an integral part of our overall position at USMEF. And we always try to say, well, what is that value to the corn producer? What value does Nick and the Colorado Corn Board, Colorado Corn Administrative Committee have in investing in U.S. red meat exports? Can we put a finger on it? And I think we can. And we always kind of knew what that would be and tossed around some facts and figures. And finally, I said, it'd be interesting to get a third party in and do a study for us. So Dave Juday, I've known him for a lot of years. He's one of these scary, smart economists that likes numbers. And I asked Dave if he could work on this for the U.S. Meat Export Federation. Dave, he decided that he could do it. And I'm going to just turn it over to Dave with the next slide, and he can explain his methodology and what exports mean to corn producers here in the United States.
All right, thanks, John. Nick and everybody from Colorado Corn, thanks for having me on this morning. Nick, we can go to the next slide, I think. It's just, this is a little bit weird here, but this slide was put together when we first presented this a few months ago. And as John mentioned, after all of his years working with MEF, he never thought people would complain about exports, but they have. And, we've had a couple prominent U.S. senators speak out about the, shame of exporting during COVID and how this was taking food away from Americans, et cetera, especially during the COVID crisis. So one of the things I just put up there was the whole, just kind of addressing head on this argument that if we tamp down on exports in times of crisis, it would help with our own domestic supply. And it wouldn't really. And, it's a complicated story if you're not familiar with the meat industry. But one thing that everybody's experienced, and I think it's a good little baseline for the press and for policymakers and others, is to look at energy. We used to, for the same reasons, we used to say we're not going to export crude oil because we need it at home. And that will, make it cheaper at home and increase the supplies for Americans. Well, it doesn't work. What happens when you embargo something and keep it at home, you don't long the domestic market, you short the international market. And when you're in a big commodity that trades and is based off of international prices, you're not doing yourself any good. So I just put together this little chart about the similarities. So in 2015, or end of December 2015, we took off the crude oil export ban. Look at that blue line on the chart. Look at how much production has increased since we did that, since we accessed the export markets. And of course, those are all jobs and supporting other parts of the economy, just like the meat industry does. And look, domestic demand hasn't changed all that much to drive that. So this is a little bit of just an academic exercise, but there is a case study sort of to look at when people start criticizing, that we're exporting meat when we need to be focused on the domestic market. And as John showed you with all the cutout charts, people will pay more in other parts of the country than Americans will pay for certain cuts. And that increases the value to everybody, the benefits to the consumer, the value to the producer, and the demand for corn here back in the States. So anyway, just again, just a little background on kind of our case study of how important exports are to globally traded commodities that have kind of complex different parts, like the different cuts of meat or the different types of fuel that crude oil's refined into. That's probably way too much time on that slide. So next one. Show the rate of growth of corn use since 2015 when we first did this study for John, and have updated a couple times. This is the rate of growth by percent of the use of corn. So you can see food, seed, and industrials grown about 2% over the past 5 years. Feed has grown about 6%. Direct overall feed. Direct exports have grown about 9%. And beef and pork exports, the portion of corn demand and feed that they use has grown 28%. Why does that matter to a corn grower? Feed is feed, right? There's feed demand for corn, but as we all learned in Economics 101, the price of a commodity is really set by that marginal demand, right? You got two people at an auction, and they'll both bid something. You bring the third person in, you can push the price up a little bit, right? Well, that's kind of like what meat exports are. As they grow, they expand the demand for corn through livestock, which our domestic market wouldn't. Kind of going back to that chart before. So that's why it's important. Let's go to the next slide. And the way we kind of figured out how that value is we took a historical look at the ending stocks to use ratio. The balance sheet on corn is kind of a good little way to take an insight into prices. And so we reversed that. Instead of looking at demand as a function of price, we looked at price as a function of demand, and did a little math and flipped it around and said, what if we had no exports of beef or pork? What would happen? So we kept all the other demands the same. This isn't a long-term prospective projection because markets are dynamic, but you can take a pretty good snapshot looking back and see what happened. Kind of a forensic view. We're kind of like doing an autopsy. I'm a corn coroner here for the meat industry. But if you look back at that and you take out what demand there was for corn in red meat and throw it back into the ending stocks, and then take a look at the stocks to use ratio and price over the years, you can come up with an estimate of the price. And Nicholas, you got your little pointer. Go up to the very top to the title there, and you see the little math equations right to the right of the title. See that R squared? That's the correlation of the relationship between stocks to use and price. A correlation of 1 is perfect. That's 0.95. So now it changes over years to years, and I've looked at this back to the 1976, and there's some crazy stuff. But over about the past 10 years, this has been pretty straightforward. My guess is next year it's not going to be, because some of the MFP payments and some of the CFAP payments probably messed up marketing a little bit, and then the prices went up and down, within the season because of all the changes. But anyway, we have a pretty confident look at this price thing. So next slide, please. So last year in 2019, beef and pork exports used about 480 million bushels of corn. And if you take the annual average calendar year price in 2019 of $375, that's about $1.8 billion that came from meat exports. And it's about 46 cents per bushel of corn that came from beef and pork exports demand in 2019. That's about 12%. And if you take that 46 cents to the price of corn and apply it to the corn crop last year, that's a $6.3 billion value to corn growers. If you would have marketed that same crop without any exports, like they never existed, that would have been about $6 billion, $6.3 billion less revenue to corn growers. We can go to the next slide. DDGs are also important. So we used almost 3 million tons of DDGs in 2019. That's about $400 million of value for ethanol mills. And we based that on an average of $137 a ton last year. At the end of the day, that's about 4 cents per gallon in the gross margin for an ethanol mill in the Midwest. So even beef exports are important, going back to ethanol, its corn demand, and the people that it employs in that industry and the effect it has on the community. So next slide. So taking that, taking those numbers and looking at USDA's next 10-year outlook, which of course was done in February. They start doing that in about November of every year, and they finish it and release it in February. And we all know what happened after February of this year. So, take that with a little bit of grain of salt. But if you look at what USDA was projecting for the next 10 years for beef and pork exports, you'll see that there'll be about 6.5, 6.6 billion bushels of corn used by exports, 36 million tons of DDGs. That's about 23 billion in corn revenue over those 10 years, and about 4.5 billion in DDG revenues to ethanol mills over the next 10 years. Go ahead for the next slide. And here's what it looks like for states. We kind of broke all this down. The revenue, that first column is the revenue, that's that $3.75 calendar year 2019 price times all the corn that went into exports. The 2018 the next column is the 46 cents a bushel. And then we have the number of acres that you need that are supported directly by red meat exports. And the last column is the DDG value of red meat exports. And as you can see, we listed out all the top corn states that are about 90% of total U.S. corn production. Colorado there is on the bottom line, as you can see. And that's all the numbers from those ways to look at how red meat exports support corn growers. Happy to follow up through Nicholas if there's ever any questions or anybody wants a little more info on this. I'm happy to provide it.
Dave, this is John Henners. I was just looking at the last Colorado Corn's quarterly magazine, and they do have an update in that magazine, a one-pager on page 17. But if we didn't have the red meat exports at all, the state of Colorado or Colorado corn producers in 2019 would have been about 75 million less revenue than what we'd normally have. So it's kind of one of the numbers that we put into the formula after the fact, but just wanted to share that with you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. That was very, very informative. And what we're going to do now is if anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box or into the Q&A box. We'll go ahead and stop sharing this slideshow. We can always go back to it if there's any questions. But in the meantime, please feel free to type those in the chat box, and then I'll start also bringing people online so that if they do have a question, they can ask it live and in person. But kind of as we go forward, I guess I get to take first stab at this. And this is kind of looking towards the future of where is U.S. Meat Export Federation, other than South Africa and the African continent, what other markets are up and comers and going to be a great place for the USMEF to focus their time and effort in growing demand?
Well, Nicholas, that's a great question, and I think one of the traps we find ourselves in is we always identify a market like Korea or the Philippines, but really what we're trying to do is particle marketing, and I think there's markets within markets that we have not even tapped. And for example, the convenience store sector in many of these countries are different than what we're used to here in the United States. The convenience store sector are actually in some of these heavy metropolitan areas, they'll have warm food that gets changed out every 2 hours. So if we can get more U.S. product being utilized in that warm food, there's a convenience store, one convenience store for every 1,200 citizens in Korea, one convenience store for every 2,500 citizens in Japan. If we can continue to get our product and we'll focus on those convenience stores, that's going to be a huge market, a huge growth market for U.S. meats. So that's one thing. But I think in general text, when you're talking about where do we see growth, you cannot ignore the money that's in the Asia market. So I think throughout Asia, they're going to demand more and more high quality products. So we're going to keep our foot on the gas pedal in Asia. Now, how does that look? I think there's potential for more market growth in Japan, more market growth in South Korea. I would say China, just due to their disease issues, you cannot ignore China. But I say that with a grain of salt. It's not your most reliable market. Dave Jade would agree with me. When China needs us, they use us as a food bank, and we've got a lot of product. But you got to remember, China's very good at growing products as well, as long as they can keep their disease under control. So it's unfortunate that any country would suffer African swine fever, but China got that and devastated their hogs, and they were protein deficit. So they did buy from all over the world, including the United States, and that's why you see some of our pork exports as high as they are. But that's not going to be the case every year. So, there's potential in Vietnam, there's potential in the ASEAN region, but you're also competing with Australia in some of those markets. But I would say Asia, for the most part, will be continuing to be a growth market for exports, just because they have the buying power.
That's great, and hopefully there's a lot of potential there in the future, so we can sell some more beef and through that more corn.
Dave, do you got anything to add to that?
No, that's your job.
Okay.
Where the beef growth is.
So, if anybody does have a question, please feel free to chime in, unmute yourself, or use the raise hand feature, and we'll get you on. One thing I wanted to go back to that you pointed out in your slides, John, was you had the value of exports per fed head slaughtered in years, and you saw 2003 up in between that $100 and $150 range, and then it dropped precipitously in 2004. Was that the cow that stole Christmas?
Yeah, it certainly was a great observation. We know disease can be critical to exports. And when we had the BSE situation, mad cow, that hit the United States, exports shut off. So certainly we had a little that went into Mexico and Canada that first year, and they were, a salvation to us. But, it took us a long time to get back into these Asia markets. We had to do risk assessments. We've got this great university at Colorado State University that helped with a lot of that. We brought trade teams in. And brought them to ranches, exposed our feedlots, showed them feed mills throughout. And Colorado is a very important state to basically getting that market back open, because we'd have all these teams that would come in, and we would go out to ranches like Running Creek Ranch in Elizabeth, and Joey Friend would just open up his books and say, look, I can tell you every calf that was ever born here. We put in this verification. We know we can trace that animal here and there. And that really helped a lot build confidence, specifically in Korea and Japan, in opening those markets. So, it took a little longer for China. China just came around about 2.5 years ago, but nonetheless, producers and their involvement, check off dollars. We couldn't have done it without the financial well-being of working with USDA and having the support of organizations like yours, Nicholas.
And kind of a second part to that, you look at it and it took years for us to recover back to where we were. Knowing that we've been experiencing this COVID situation, we're seeing a blip in our exports. Do you think that it's going to take as much time, or was that unique circumstance due to BSE?
I think we're going to rebound pretty quick. Food service will be tougher. Just going out to eat and getting that good feel, that great experience and feeling safe. Those things will be a little slower in recovery, but we've experienced a boom in retail. Just like domestically here in the United States, we've experienced a boom. Now, one thing to think about that is, if we're selling a ribeye steak at retail, what's the price the industry's getting for that ribeye steak at retail, as opposed to selling that ribeye steak at a white tablecloth restaurant? So, you're losing dollars as far as, throughout that selling that steak at, I don't know, $12 a pound, as opposed to double or triple that if you go through a nice restaurant at retail. So, or at food service. So those are the things that kind of catch you off guard and say, how can we get back to that? And granted, if it goes through food service, a nice restaurant, you're going to have to pay the bricks and mortar of the restaurant and the help and the service and everything else. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you're getting a higher value for that piece of protein when it goes through food service, as opposed to being on a shelf at the retail store.
Yeah, well, it sounds like I hear a combine in the background, and I notice Rod has unmuted himself. Rod, do you have a question?
I hope you can hear me.
I'm clear.
Yeah, ag products in Colorado seems like our major export is to Mexico, particularly pork. Can you tell me what Colorado gets out of the Mexico, or imports to Mexico, as far as beef and pork and chicken and everything?
Well, I would agree with you. I don't have those statistics right in front of me. I know the Colorado Department of Ag. I work very closely with them on some of the state-specific exports. But we've done trade missions. We've worked with the Colorado Department of Ag into Mexico, and Mexico's a huge market for our protein exports as it relates to beef and pork. If Mexico ever closed its borders to the United States, we would have a tremendous mess. It would be a wreck on our hands as it relates to pork exports, because they take the majority of hams from the United States. They take that ham and they debone it in Mexico, and it goes into further processing. You've got to remember, in Mexico, you've got 129 million people, and that's a great population, but they don't quite always have the means to buy
Well, I think we had a little bit of technical difficulty there. I think we lost John.
John froze up. Well, I do know, just to finish up for him, because I've heard him say it many times. So, Mexico buys more pork from the U.S. than any country has ever bought from any other country in the world. At one point, they bought 8% of our production. So it's a hugely important market, and it's growing. As John said, a lot of stuff is further processed. That's why they also buy turkey. But it's a key market for the U.S. And of course, where the stuff comes from is, all across the country, but there are plants that are more suited to supply the Mexico market, some to the Asia market, et cetera. But all that Colorado corn and pork does flow into Mexico, definitely.
Yeah, very, very important market for us. And also with the USMCA in place, that just helps modernize everything and hopefully really increase that flow of goods and goods that we produce into those markets so that we can help, feed that growing population down there. So is there any other questions out there from the audience? We have Dave still with us. Hopefully we'll get John back here in a second for anything else. But is there any other questions that, Dave, or I don't know if I could answer them. I'm not an expert in this area, but that we could answer for you? I don't know if you'll know this answer, Dave, but we look at these growing markets, and there's a limited amount of shelf space. John was talking about competition and all these. Who are our biggest competition in terms of exporting beef and getting shelf space? Do you know the answer to that?
Well, South America primarily. The big exporters are Canada, and their product is the most similar to ours in terms of grain fed and quality. Then you have South America, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and then that's primary, and New Zealand and Australia. But a lot of their exports come to the U.S. And we ship our marbled grain-fed beef to the export market, and we import some of the grass-fed trimming, to make hamburger for grind. So the system all kind of balances out. I remember, this is a few years ago, and I couldn't cite chapter and verse, but I remember looking at Brazil and the U.S., their top 10 export markets for beef and pork. And I think in both categories, out of the top 10 markets, we really only had overlap in 2 or 3. And the big competition, there's going to be growing competition in China with South America, Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina all ship there. And then the other thing is in Japan, which is the highest value market. They pay the most dollars. That's Canada, Australia, and New Zealand because of their proximity. Those are some of the main competitors. And what we saw in Japan when they entered their trade agreement and rolled back everyone else's tariffs, but not the U.S., that we did start to lose market share, and we lost it to Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. Now, of course, we're back on an equal footing.
Yeah, that's great to know. So it looks like there's a lot of opportunities out there, and we'll give one last call. It looks like we have a hand up. Rod, do you have another question? And we'll call this the last one before we hop off, because I know John's having
okay. Can you
back logged in?
Yeah, Dave. I don't know if this is a good question, but from corn grower perspective, is the grass-fed beef making huge inroads into the buying public?
From my perspective, no. It's a niche product, and it's not a major competition. I think it'll always be there, and it'll be a little, have a little slice, but it's not. And if it was, we wouldn't be importing beef from Australia, New Zealand, and South America to make hamburger here because there'd be enough of it here. So I don't, you know, it's a lot of hype, but it's not a major threat.
Okay, well, I know I have relatives in California, and they just touted the grass-fed beef to me, and I said, well, you do know when they make their hamburger, you know what kind of tallow they put into their hamburger? Corn-fed tallow. So anyway, it tastes great there. So when they found that out, they opened their eyes a little bit. So whatever. I think I'd already have a grass-fed elk than beef.
Yeah, it's you know, it's an ongoing issue of the nutrition perspective, but you know, one thing, this whole keto diet, that, you know, fat's not as bad as they say. It's really having an impact, because if you look over the past 4 or 5 years, what's happened in the cutouts for hogs, for cattle, where the rib is grown, chickens, where dark meat values are going up faster than white meat values, and in dairy, where butter goes through the roof and cheese goes through the roof. Um, you know, that we're on the beginning of another trend of that's kind of the opposite of what put people on the grass-fed trend. So it's a constant. You know, that's what markets are. They're dynamic and demand changes, and the key is to keeping up with it.
Very fickle.
Thank you.
Very fickle, yeah. Like, it's fickle like John Henner's internet connection, and he sits in a high rise in downtown Denver, and it cuts out, and Rod's on a combine, and he's just fine. So.
Oh, that seems how it always goes, isn't it?
That's right.
Oh, and I was going to ask John, and maybe you can give us a little bit of illumination on this, Dave. But you know, one thing that keeps us from, you know, accessing a lot of these markets is tariffs, and, you know, just access to those markets on a cost prohibitive basis. You know, what is USMEF doing, and how are we working to make sure that those tariffs are lowered and that we have equal and free access to those markets, just like other countries across the world? Because as John's saying, we provide probably one of the best, if not the best, product in the market. But if you can't get it there because there's a 20+% tariff on it, that's another barrier.
Yeah, I don't want to overstep my brief here and speak to what USMEF is doing strategically, and short-term, long-term plan, and day-to-day. But I do know, because I've helped them on some projects, that they do work very diligently on these kind of issues. Japan comes to mind with the Japan Free Trade Agreement, because I helped them calculate some numbers that all the way down to employment impact and state by state, from exports to Japan. We added the corn use information and everything, that they sat down with the U.S. trade representative and went through with them, explained how the market works, how Japan's not our biggest volume market, but it's our biggest value market. And they're very active in those kinds of things. They have folks in all those countries that monitor what's going on day to day, to feedback. So I know they are very, very active on that. And that's something that I'm sure John could give you more insight into, the target list of countries and kind of the key tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers that we need to get over. You know, the deal with China, and the deal with the EU and the high quality beef quotas. You know, those were also some regulatory issues besides just tariffs. So I know USMEF keeps up on that and works to open those markets.
Well, that is great. Thank you for that, Dave. You know, we are approaching that 8:30 time frame, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time because it is a busy time of year. So Dave, thank you so much for joining us today and giving us your insights on the value that beef exports add to our corn price here at home. And thank you everybody who joined us today. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day. Hopefully you garnered a little bit of information about what's being done on your behalf through the beef exports and all protein exports of beef, pork, and lamb throughout the globe, and how they're working to grow those each and every day for better market access and for more value on what you do on the ground out in Eastern Colorado. So again, thank you for joining us. And if you do have any further questions, please don't hesitate to email myself or contact the Colorado Corn Administrative Committee with those, and we'll try and get in touch with Dave or John and get those questions answered to the best of our abilities. So again, thank you, and we look forward to having more of these in the future, and we will see you sometime else. Stay safe out there.